It was the year 1893, and in the rolling hills of Tennessee, life was defined by silence, hardship, and the slow rhythm of men working themselves into the ground. The winters carried a stillness, so heavy that people often said you could feel it pressing against your chest. In the distance, wooden cabins leaned against the hillsides, their chimneys coughing smoke into skies dimmed by the weight of coal dust drifting from the mines. This land was unforgiving, its beauty hidden beneath layers of hunger, sweat, and the constant struggle to survive. In the center of this quiet hardship lived a boy named Caleb Blackwood. He was the eldest son of Thomas and Ellen Blackwood, born in a small shack barely holding itself together at the edge of Hollow Creek. From the moment he could walk, Caleb carried responsibilities far beyond his fragile shoulders. His father worked in the Blackwood mine, named not for their family, but for its reputation, black as soot, dark as a grave. His mother washed clothes for the wealthier families across town, stretching pennies into scraps of bread and thin broth. Caleb, being the oldest, learned quickly to help his mother care for his younger siblings. But while his hands were always occupied with chores, collecting kindling, hauling water, watching over the others, his eyes were different. He had a gaze that never stopped moving, always searching, always watching. Unlike most children, whose minds filled with laughter or games, Caleb carried a quiet awareness. He noticed the things that adults overlooked, the sound of the wheel grinding at the mill, the way the clouds shifted across the mountain peaks, the flicker of lantern light disappearing at dusk into the open mouth of the coal mine. There was something about the mine that drew him in, not with the innocence of childish curiosity, but with the intensity of a boy who already understood that his fate, like every boy in the town, would eventually lead him underground. Every morning, when men passed with their helmets clutched in calloused hands, their boots caked with dirt, Caleb stood and watched. He saw not just the miners, but the shadows that seemed to cling to them as they crossed into the hills. The men knew the mine as both a provider and a predator. Some carried scars. Some carried coughs that rattled the lungs in their chests. Many carried stories they would never tell their children. Whispers passed quietly in saloons or along narrow dirt roads. Stories about men who had gone missing, tunnels that swallowed sound whole, or shafts that seemed deeper than the earth itself. And it was from these whispers that Caleb's imagination began to grow. The Blackwood mine was ruled by supervisors the townsfolk grimly nicknamed the Iron Men. They were outsiders, hard-eyed, cold-voiced, and merciless in their demand for coal and labor. To them, every miner was replaceable, every child a future worker. They treated the community not as families, but as cogs in a great grinding machine. The mine came first. Always. Caleb, though only 11, felt that reality pressed against him every time he approached the ridge where the tunnels yawned open. One morning, before dawn had fully broken over the hills, Caleb lingered near the edge of the mine while delivering a bucket of food to his father. The main entrance bustled with noise, the clang of picks, the creak of carts. But a side tunnel, barely reinforced with timbers, hidden in partial shadow, caught Caleb's attention. Unlike the main drift, this tunnel seemed different. It was too still. The silence was unnatural, as though it consumed every echo before it reached the air. He stared into its depths, unable to look away. For just a second, just the briefest flicker, it seemed that something moved inside. A shadow, fragile as smoke, slipped across the darkness. Caleb blinked, and it was gone. But the impression branded itself in his mind. Days later, rumors spread through the town. Some miners muttered that the side tunnel was cursed, that men who entered it sometimes came out changed. Changed how? No one said, at least not aloud. Others dismissed such talk as nonsense born from superstition and exhaustion. Yet Caleb listened. Every word stored itself away in his young mind, building a quiet storm of questions. At home, he asked nothing. He pretended to keep his silence. But at night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling boards of their shack, hearing in his imagination the deep creak of the mine timbers, the whisper of shifting rock, and that unnatural silence that clung to the tunnel. The pull grew stronger. The mine was calling him. One evening in late November, Caleb witnessed something that would tighten the grip of the mystery around him. The wind blew cold across the valley, and the smell of smoke drifted heavy through the streets. As he passed near the colliery road, returning from an errand to carry firewood, he saw Hale, an older miner most people respected, stumbling out from that same silent tunnel. His face was pale as bone, his lips trembling but silent, his eyes fixed wide open, as if he had seen something no man was meant to see. Without a word, Hale rushed past, shaking as he vanished toward his shack at the far end of the road. By nightfall, whispers consumed the supper tables. Some said Hale had seen lanterns burning deep where there should have been none. Others swore he'd heard voices, low and strange, calling his name from the darkness. Whatever he had seen, the old miner refused to speak of it. He shut his door and locked himself away. Caleb was silent at the table. He had no words. But inside that restless mind of his, questions grew like fire. He could not stop thinking about Hale's face, the fear carved into his features. He thought about the side tunnel and the way it had stared back at him. He thought of shadows that might not be there, or that perhaps always were. And slowly, the outline of his destiny began to form. Caleb Blackwood, a boy of only 11 years, was moving toward a place from which no road returned. The town did not yet know, but the mine had fixed its eyes upon him. For some people, fate arrives like a storm, sudden and overwhelming. For others, it creeps in quietly, like fog drifting through a valley, unnoticed until it covers every path. For Caleb, fate began with silence. A silence deep inside a tunnel. A silence that was waiting. And in that silence, he would vanish forever. Winter bore its teeth over the hills of Tennessee, the kind of winter that cut through wooden walls and crept beneath threadbare blankets. For the Blackwood family, survival meant endurance and hunger in cold nights, in days stretched too thin. Caleb helped his mother wherever he could. He chopped wood. He hauled water from the creek, even as ice formed around the buckets. And he tried to keep his younger brother and sister warm whenever their fire dwindled to embers. Yet for all his usefulness, he was still a child in a place that had no patience for children. In Hallow Creek, youth vanished quickly. Boys became workers as soon as their hands could grasp a shovel, and girls turned into caretakers, cooking, sewing, laboring as much as their mothers. By 11 years old, Caleb felt the weight of responsibility pressing against him like a miner's load of coal. But even beneath that weight, his curiosity about the mine would not let him go. The story of Hale's fright lingered in whispers on the streets. Some men laughed at him, mocking his ghost tales, but others lowered their voices when they spoke of it, their eyes shifting warily toward the hills. Caleb overheard fragments wherever he went, and piece by piece, those fragments turned into a puzzle his young mind longed to solve. At the table one evening, his father spoke of it at last. Thomas Blackwood was a man beaten by labor, but proud in his silence. He rarely wasted words, but that night he dropped his fork and muttered, "Something's wrong in that side shaft." He didn't look at anyone, just stared at the table as the words escaped. His mother shook her head, pressing him to stop, to let such talk die in the air. But to Caleb, those words were fuel. If his father, a man hardened by years underground, admitted unease, then what lay in the mine was no mere fancy. The boy felt both fear and fascination intertwine. His heart raced each time he imagined returning to the ridge, peering again into that dark throat of earth. Days passed, then weeks, as the season grew harsher. Food dwindled. His father came home coughing harder each night, the black coal dust etched deep into his skin. The atmosphere in the shack darkened. Tension tightened around the family like the cold wind outside. It was in these tense hours, when survival blurred into suffering, that Caleb's obsession with the mine deepened. Perhaps it was a distraction. Perhaps it was a search for meaning in a world that seemed shaped only by labor and hunger. Whatever it was, it drew him toward the earth like an undertow. One midday, while carrying firewood near the colliery track, Caleb lingered again by the ridge. He watched the miners spread out, their boots crunching gravel. He saw the lamps flicker in dawn's weak light, each flame swallowed quickly as the men vanished underground. And again, the side shaft stood there, quiet, waiting. his eyes fixed on it longer than before. "Stay away from that drift," an old voice rasped. Caleb turned and saw an older miner leaning against a cart. His face was marked by decades of soot, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion. The man spat to the side before muttering, "There's places down there even the rock won't hold you. Places with no business for curious eyes." The words cut sharp, but Caleb said nothing. He lowered his head and clutched the firewood tighter before walking away. But deep down he knew, warnings only strengthened his desire. That evening he lay awake again, the words replaying in his thoughts. Even the rock won't hold you. What did that mean? Did the earth itself reject the shaft? He imagined timbers creaking, tunnels shifting, shadows swallowing voices whole. The mine was not simply a place of work, it was alive, in its own buried way, and some parts of it did not want to be disturbed. The mystery grew heavier. Weeks later, hunger struck sharper than before. The winter storm had smothered the valley for 3 straight days. What few supplies they had were running out. His mother rationed cornbread, so thin it was little more than a bite. His father forcefully reassured them that payday was coming, though the cough in his chest grew louder, deeper. Caleb saw through it. The man's lungs were failing, and all the money in the world could not buy air. On the 4th morning, a chill wind cut across the hills as Caleb decided to take a detour on his chores. He veered down to the mine road, carrying a small bundle of sticks under his arm, just an excuse to approach. The closer he drew, the more he felt something pressing, a gravity not of weight, but of pull. The ridge seemed to lean toward him. The tunnel, like a gaping mouth, seemed to breathe. Other boys dared not go near. They whispered about him behind their hands, saying Caleb had strange eyes, that he was too quiet, that he would one day walk where no one returned. The mine unsettled everyone, but it was as though it had singled him out. And perhaps it had. That day, standing alone on the ridge, Caleb listened. He held his breath, straining, waiting, searching against silence itself. And faintly, so faintly he almost doubted his own ears, he thought he heard something. Not voices, not exactly, but rhythms. A faint cadence beneath the earth, too regular to be stones shifting, too distant to be the miner's picks. Something deliberate, something deeper. His chest tightened. He turned quickly away and ran, the sticks rattling in his arms. But fear did not stop him. It only sharpened his resolve to know what waited beneath. At supper that night, his younger sister asked if the earth itself could sing. His jaw tightened at her question, but he said nothing. The world had already decided enough for him. Children weren't allowed thoughts that reached too far. His mother hushed the girl quickly, scolding her for childish nonsense. But Caleb couldn't stop replaying that faint rhythm. The sound lingered in his ears even after the candles were blown out. The mine was no longer simply there. It was inside him now, etched into his every thought. He could almost feel the tunnels beneath the ground as if they stretched under his own home, their shadows pressing upward through the dirt. He knew, with a clarity that chilled him, that he would not resist for long. It was only a matter of time before he stepped inside. For now, though, the boy lay silent in the dark as the winter pressed colder around their shack. And somewhere beneath the frozen Tennessee earth, something waited with a patience beyond human years. Something that had chosen him already. By December of 1893, the townsfolk of Hollow Creek had grown accustomed to the sound of coughing echoing through the valley. It seemed to travel from one shack to another, a chorus of shaking lungs hardened and destroyed by years spent in the depths. Caleb heard it at home every night, his father's ragged gasps filling the silence of their single room. For the boy, it was like a reminder, a steady signal of where his own path was expected to lead. The mine did not just take coal, it took men piece by piece. It aged the strong long before their time. And in the middle of this bleak routine, Caleb felt the presence of that side shaft, silent, waiting, as though the darkness itself was calling his name. The people of Hollow Creek clung to a rhythm of survival, and in that rhythm, everyone had a place. But Caleb never truly seemed to belong. Other boys his age sometimes laughed, sometimes played in the mud streets or skipped stones on the frozen creek. Caleb instead watched. He spent hours perched on fences or leaning against the wooden posts that lined the road. his eyes always drawn back to the ridge. What others ignored, he studied until his chest grew heavy. One morning, as the mist still hung between the trees, Caleb followed the trail leading to the mine with purposeful steps. He had no excuse that day, no errands, no delivery, no firewood bundles. He walked simply because he was pulled there. From the ridge above, he saw the stream of miners trudging into the shaft, their lanterns bobbing like stars swallowed by the earth. The strong voices of men, calling one another, grew faint with distance. And then silence again, except for one place. The side drift. It lay apart from the others, framed poorly by timber supports half-rotten from dampness. No men entered, no wagons rolled out. Its mouth gaped open, and the stillness inside was different somehow. Not the calm of quiet work, but the kind of silence that seemed alive, watchful. Caleb stood at its edge. His boots sank slightly in the damp soil. A chill crept outward from the blackness, so sharp that even the winter air seemed warmer in comparison. For a long while, he did not move. The boy felt like he stood at the wall dividing two worlds, the life he knew above ground and whatever waited below. He leaned forward, his hand brushing the wooden post at the entrance. And then he froze. A faint sound drifted out. Not footsteps, not voices, not even the dull rhythm he thought he'd once heard before. This sound was more elusive, like the hollow sigh of air moving through lungs too deep within the earth to belong to any man. His heart pounded once, twice. Then footsteps came from behind. Caleb jerked back just as a group of older miners approached along the path. Their eyes passed over him in silence, but a few muttered warnings under their breath. One spat on the ground. Another snapped sharply, "Boy, you keep away from there." Shame burned in his chest, but it wasn't enough to break the pull. He stumbled away, arms crossed, pretending he hadn't been staring into the forbidden drift. But the memory of that breath, so faint, so ghostly, lodged itself in his bones. That night, the Blackwood shack shook with the sound of his father's coughs. Caleb lay wide awake, listening to each violent hack, watching the shadows of the firelight tremble on the wall. His mother moved softly, wiping sweat from Thomas's brow, whispering comfort he barely heard. Caleb clenched his fists, powerless. His father's sickness was a certainty, as much a part of Hallow Creek life as the coal dust itself. And the mine loomed above it all, the giver and taker, the sustainer and the destroyer. No one escaped it. For Caleb, the hopelessness of that night hardened something inside him. He imagined that dark tunnel, silent and hollow, and thought, if the mine takes everyone, then it must also hold its secrets. And I will be the one to find them. The next day, snow drifted in heavy sheets across the valley. The town slowed, muffled beneath white drifts that piled against doorways and muffled the crunch of boots. Still, the miners went to work, stomping through snow with their collars pulled high. Caleb wandered close again, carrying nothing but his restless curiosity. He stood from a distance, staring. The tunnel was snow-dusted at its edges, but the darkness inside remained unchanged. When the wind howled, snowflakes swirled toward its mouth, yet seemed to vanish instantly in the blackness, as though consumed. That vision stayed with him. Each night it replayed, each moment pulling him closer. Slowly, Caleb's world shrank. It no longer mattered what errands he ran or what meals his mother scraped together. Every day narrowed to one thought, stepping into that tunnel. He began to imagine it vividly, imagined his footsteps echoing, imagined the lantern light shaking against the rough stone, imagined passing beyond the point where sound should carry, and yet hearing something else. The rhythm beneath the earth. The sigh of hidden lungs. The mind was not simply calling him, no. It was waiting for him. One evening, he crept out of the shack while his siblings slept and his parents whispered low at the fire. He walked the frozen road by moonlight, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Toward the ridge he went, each step crunching softly in fresh snow. The town lay silent, all except for him, the boy tracing a dangerous path. When at last he stood at the mine mouth, lantern light flickering faintly in the distance from the main drift, he turned toward the side shaft. And there it was, darker than dark, stiller than still. He stood motionless, his pulse beating louder in his head than the wind itself. For a moment he thought he would step forward. For a moment the silence seemed to lean toward him. But a figure stirred across the snow, a shadow. Caleb staggered back, his chest tight with panic, until he realized it was only a miner heading home late, his lamp swaying with each slow step. Caleb fled before he could be seen, the sting of fear mixing with the burn of disappointment. The night closed behind him, but the decision had already been written. One day soon, he would not stop at the entrance. He would cross into the drift. He would descend. And Hollow Creek, whether ready or not, would remember the boy who walked into darkness. The first dawn of the new year crept slowly over Hollow Creek, thin light pushing against a sky heavy with storm clouds. To most, it was simply another day, another morning to rise weary, to trudge toward the mines, to labor until bone and breath gave out. But for one boy, this morning carried the weight of inevitability. Caleb Blackwood rose before anyone else in the shack stirred. His siblings still lay curled beneath blankets, their faces pale from the long winter. His father coughed weakly at the fireside while his mother pressed a handkerchief against his lips, eyes tight with worry. Caleb slipped quietly past them, clutching nothing, no excuse for leaving. What he carried instead was resolve. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he climbed toward the ridge. The valley lay silent behind him, chimneys leaking faint wisps of smoke that hung against the mountain air. Ahead, the colliery loomed black against the pale morning, timbers creaking, carts frozen in place, tools scattered like bones across the yard. Even from a distance, the smell of coal dust mingled with the sharp bite of cold. By the time the miners emerged for work, their lamps sparking to life one by one, Caleb had already taken his place nearby. He watched as they filed through the main entrance, their laughter forced, their talk clipped short. He wondered if any of them truly grasped the danger of the shaft that lay just feet away from where they walked. Or perhaps they all knew, and simply refused to give it voice. When the commotion faded and most had already gone underground, Caleb's eyes turned. The side tunnel gaped in stillness, barren, undisturbed. It felt wrong, in the way an empty church does, the shape of something that once held life, now filled only with silence. He stepped forward. For weeks he had stood at this edge, feeling the press of fear and fascination. This time, he did not pull back. His hand trembled as it touched the slick timber post. His breath fogged in the cold, but the air spilling out from the tunnel was colder still, damp and heavy as though it carried the weight of the entire mountain. Caleb took a step, then another. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoed faintly before being swallowed almost instantly by the dark. The light from outside bent away, fading quicker than he expected, leaving only thin slivers of dim glow at the edges of stone. Inside, the silence closed around him. There were no voices, no ringing of picks, none of the noises he knew from the main drift. This was deeper quiet, and with each heartbeat he felt himself carried further into it. He paused when he thought he heard something faint, an echo he remembered from before, the rhythm beneath the earth. A slow, deep pattern, barely audible, like a drum muffled far away. He froze, holding his breath, trying to separate the sound from the pounding of his own heart. And then it was gone, or maybe it had been nothing at all. The boy pressed further. He traced the wall with his fingers, the damp stone slick beneath his touch. Every few feet rotted timbers supported the sides, but they were crooked, unstable, as though the tunnel resisted every effort to be held. Somewhere ahead, the darkness thickened. Caleb's chest tightened. Suddenly, a groan swept through the shaft. A wooden beam creaked, the sound shrill against the silence. Dust rained softly from above, peppering his hair and coat. Caleb stumbled back, eyes wide, convinced the entire place would collapse. For a long moment he stood frozen. Then slowly, the groan faded and silence returned. Relief came, but behind it was something worse. An awareness that he no longer wanted to leave. Fear and pull intertwined so tightly now that he couldn't untangle them. He took another step, and another. Each moved him farther from the world above and deeper into one that seemed built for him alone. Minutes passed. The shaft curved slightly, just enough to cut off all view of the morning light behind him. When Caleb turned back, there was only blackness in both directions. His throat tightened, not from panic at being lost, but from awe. For the first time in his life, he stood where no other soul dared to linger. The silence pressed close, and then, faintly, just faintly, he heard breathing. It was not his. It was steady, low, rising and falling as though the earth itself inhaled and exhaled in perfect rhythm. Caleb's knees weakened. Reality tilted around him. Every instinct screamed to flee, but another force held him still, an unseen weight that demanded he listen. For a moment, he swore the sound spoke, though no words formed. It was a message without language, a feeling inside his bones. And then footsteps, real ones this time, echoing faintly behind him, back toward the entrance. Caleb spun, heart pounding, certain he'd been followed. Lantern light flickered around the curve of the shaft. Someone was there, moving closer. Panic surged. Caleb pressed against the wall, forcing himself into the shadows. He watched as the light grew brighter, footsteps nearer. Then a miner emerged. Hale, the same man who had once fled pale-faced from this very tunnel. His lantern swayed in shaking hands, casting his features in trembling flame. Caleb's breath caught. Hale looked older than Caleb remembered, as though months had aged him into years. His eyes darted nervously, his lips moving with whispered fragments Caleb couldn't hear. The man stumbled forward, deeper into the shaft, muttering words like prayers. The boy dared not move. He dared not speak. He could only watch as Hale passed by, drawn onward by something Caleb could not see. Then suddenly, the man froze mid-step, his eyes wide, his head jerking upward as though listening. Caleb waited, terror gnawing at his chest. And then, without warning, Hale turned, his lantern swinging, his face briefly lit in horror. But he didn't see Caleb. Instead, Hale bolted forward into the deeper dark, vanishing around the curve, his footsteps echoing until silence claimed them again. The boy stood trembling. The shaft now belonged to him alone. At last, the fear overtook even his fascination. His body guided him back, his legs unsteady as he stumbled toward the faint suggestion of daylight far, far away. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as though the mine wanted to hold him inside. But somehow he broke free. The pale winter sun blinded his eyes as he staggered into the open air. Caleb gasped, lungs filling with wind that felt too thin, too fragile. Behind him, the side shaft loomed, unchanged, still and silent. But now, the silence carried depth, a promise, a threat. He knew he would return. Hale's presence had proven it. There was something more down there, something unseen that pulled men inside. And next time, Caleb vowed, he would not turn back so soon. The days following Caleb's first steps inside the shaft passed like a blur, as though time itself had lost weight. Outside, snow still blanketed the hills, cracking under wagon wheels, soft against the roofs of shacks sagging under its weight. Inside the Blackwood home, the cough of Thomas Blackwood grew sharper. At night, it rolled through the shack like thunder trapped beneath the rafters, a reminder of the mine's claim slowly pulling him downward. Caleb sat awake, listening to his father's labored breathing. He thought of the tunnel, the sound he had heard in its depths, the breathing not his own. It seemed impossible to separate one from the other. His father gasping in their shack, the mine itself sighing beneath the earth. Both belonged to the same rhythm. Both pressed against Caleb until his chest ached with the weight of it. During the day, Caleb followed his routine, chopping wood, hauling water, running errands when asked. But nothing held him. His attention frayed constantly toward the ridge. Each time he glimpsed the mouth of the shaft, his bones stirred with a restless energy, as though a string tied deep inside the earth tugged him closer. But the memory of Hale lingered even stronger than the shaft itself. Caleb had seen the man that night, lantern swinging, whispering to himself like a soul unraveling, and then gone, swallowed deeper into the black. But when the shift ended the next morning, Hale had returned to town, shoulders hunched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The story spread quickly. Some said Hale barely worked at all anymore, that he disappeared from the main tunnels for hours at a time. His pay docked heavily for it. Others claimed he avoided sunlight, spending entire days behind the flimsy door of his shack. Caleb watched him whenever he could. Hale's steps grew slower, his hands shook constantly, and his eyes, when they met the boys, looked hollow. One night, passing along the frozen road, Caleb lingered by Hale's cabin. The lamplight glowed faint beneath the crack in the door, and the sound of muttering seeped out. Caleb held his breath, leaning closer. The words were jumbled, fevered, but they carried the cadence of repetition, like prayers or oaths. He whispered to himself, "It's the mine, it's inside him." The thought both terrified and thrilled him, because if the mine had taken hold of Hale, then surely it had begun taking hold of him as well. Inside the Blackwood family, silence thickened. His mother worked herself thin, her eyes gaunt from hunger and worry. His siblings clung to her, unaware of the depth of their father's illness, unaware of the crushing pressure that hung over the family. Caleb felt older than his years, carrying burdens he could not confess. He wanted to tell them about the tunnel, tell them he had gone inside, tell them what he had heard. But the words never formed. What could he say that wouldn't sound like madness? The mine kept its secrets, and now so did he. One morning, while gathering kindling near the colliery road, Caleb noticed two miners in hushed conversation. They stood apart, voices low, faces shadowed with unease. He crouched behind a fence post, listening. Another one said, "Down the side drift. Never came back out." "Don't spread it," the other warned. "They'll dock us all, shut us up. Iron men don't want talk of vanishings." The boy's skin prickled. Another man, gone, vanished. And from the same shaft that now lived in his thoughts. He pressed his ear tighter against the wood, desperate for more. But the men fell silent, sensing prying ears, and walked off. Caleb's breath fogged in front of his face as he whispered, "It's waiting." That night, his father coughed blood. His mother cried quietly, turning her face away so the children would not see. Caleb lay awake, fists clenched, drowning in helplessness. He told himself the mine was the root, the mine was the mouth that swallowed men, and yet part of him also told himself it possessed answers. If men vanished, something down there decided their fate. And perhaps if he went far enough, he too might learn the truth. The obsession began to twist into determination. Weeks passed. The snow melted slowly under bursts of rain, leaving behind slick mud that clung to boots. The town smelled of wet dirt mixed with smoke. At the mine, the men's faces were grayer, their eyes heavier, but the work drove on. And Caleb, biding his time, began to prepare. Whenever he found himself alone, he tested his courage near the shaft. He traced the wooden posts at its entrance, stepped a pace inside, then back again. He counted the seconds he could last before fear forced him out. Once he managed 10 minutes in the dark, leaning against the damp wall, listening for that living breath deep within. Every visit took him further. Every visit loosened something inside him. He remembered Hale's face, the trembling lantern, the horror, the surrender. And though fear gnawed at Caleb's stomach, another thought burned stronger. Hale had gone deeper. And so would he. One misty morning, as he passed near the colliery, he spotted Hale again. The old miner stumbled between buildings, his hands shaking, eyes darting as though haunted by phantoms only he could see. For a frozen instant, their eyes locked. Caleb swore he saw recognition, almost pleading, in Hale's gaze. But just as quickly, Hale turned and shuffled away, lost in his muttering haze. Caleb stood still long after he had vanished. The boy's heart raced as if words had been exchanged in silence, a message passing without voice. Come back down. See for yourself. When he returned home that evening, his mother was huddled by the fire, swallowing tears as Thomas coughed violently on a cloth stained with red. His siblings clung to her, frightened but silent. Caleb watched them from the doorway, and something hardened beneath his skin. He could not heal his father, he could not ease his mother's tears, but the mine, he thought, held reasons. The mine bound them all. If it took his father, and it hollowed Hale, then perhaps inside its belly lay the truth of every misery in Hallow Creek. And he would find it. That night he whispered into the dark, I'll go deeper." The wind rattled the walls of the shack, but no one heard him. For Caleb, the choice was no longer a question of if. It was only a matter of when. The thaw of winter came slowly to Hallow Creek, but by February, streams trickled again over frozen stone, and the bitter white of snow melted into slick brown mud. The town carried on as it always had. Men trudging into the mines, women stretching rations into meals, children growing into laborers before their voices finished deepening. Yet for Caleb Blackwood, time no longer followed the simple thread of seasonal change. His thoughts now split into two worlds. One was the shack, with its constant coughs, worn blankets, and hollow stomachs that ached endlessly. The other was the shaft, that forbidden tunnel whose silence pressed closer on him with every passing day. Together, those two worlds locked him between despair and compulsion. At home, his father wasted further, now too weak to work. Some days Thomas Blackwood struggled even to sit upright, his voice gone hoarse from the strain of coughing. Caleb's mother redoubled her endless chores, washing, mending, gathering, but she couldn't fill the hole left by the lost wages. The family slipped deeper into poverty, their meals nothing more than thinned broth and scraps of bread. Caleb tried to stay strong for his younger siblings. He chopped wood, fetched water, ran errands for neighbors, anything to shoulder the burden. Yet at night, when the house fell quiet, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his father's rasping chest, and all the while felt the unseen rhythm under his own ribs. The mine was inside him. The idea of entering deeper no longer frightened him. It plagued him. Every day that passed without returning was wasted time. And so his mind naturally drifted toward what he would need if he did go back into the shaft, truly past the point of light. That meant one thing, a lantern. He had watched the miners carry them hundreds of times. Rust-marked frames, thin glass windows smudged with soot, small flames flickering inside. They were heavy with oil, but necessary for survival below. Caleb never owned one. Children didn't. But if he belonged inside that shaft, he'd need it. The opportunity came late one evening as the workday ended. Shadows stretched across the muddy yard of the colliery. The men spilled out in groups, barking laughs, cursing supervisors, clapping one another on backs. Most didn't notice the boy lingering by the fence, his eyes unusually sharp. Near the tool shed, a lantern hung unguarded on a post, its flame flickering weakly, as though forgotten. Caleb's heart pounded as he edged nearer, forcing his body to move casually despite the whirl of adrenaline. He slipped a hand around it, fingers brushing the warm handle, and lifted it gently off the post. The flame flickered nervously, almost like a heartbeat. He tucked it under his coat, flooding with fear that someone had seen. But no voice called out. No boots thundered his way. Somehow, impossibly, he had succeeded. Back at the shack, he hid it beneath loose boards under his bed. Each night, when his family lay in restless sleep, Caleb pulled it out, staring at the flame with a mix of reverence and dread. He would trace the shape of its frame, test its weight, commit its movements to muscle memory. It became more than a lantern. It became his key, a symbol of his decision to move from waiting to action. Still, one question pulled at him. If Hale had already gone where others dared not, what exactly had he seen? And why had he returned so broken? Caleb found himself following Hale quietly whenever chance allowed. The man no longer worked full shifts, drifting through town like a figure half alive. Some swore he would vanish soon entirely. But Caleb noticed something unnerving. Hale often walked the same road at night, his lantern swinging wide, muttering in cadence with each step. Twice, Caleb followed from a distance, watching him disappear toward the shaft, only to see him return before dawn, wild-eyed and whispering to himself. One bitter evening, their paths crossed face to face. Hale stumbled near the boy, the lantern light throwing his features into grotesque relief. His eyes stared hollow, yet for a heartbeat recognition returned. "You," Hale rasped, voice hoarse as stone ground against stone. "It's already got its claws in you, hasn't it?" Caleb froze, unable to speak. Hale's hand shot out, gripping the boy's coat collar. His breath stank of coal dust and rot. "Don't think you're different. It won't let you go once you've stepped inside." You'll walk till your legs give out, boy. You'll walk till there's nothing left. Then, just as quickly, Hale shoved him back, retreating, clutching at his hair as though in pain. He staggered off, muttering curses, disappearing into the dark street. Caleb stood trembling, the cold night air cutting through to the bone. But beneath the terror, a darker truth burned. Hale had named it, had spoken what Caleb already felt. The mine had chosen him. He returned home with shaking hands. Under the dim glow of his stolen lantern, in the silence of the shack, he whispered to himself, "Then let it keep me." From that night, Caleb no longer merely thought about descending. He planned. He counted hours when the mine was most empty, memorized the guard rotations of the iron men, tested how long oil burned inside the lantern before need of refill. Every detail mattered. Because when the storm of inevitability finally broke, he wouldn't resist. He would be ready. The Blackwood household carried on in silence, unaware of his inner war. His father slipped closer to the grave with each cough. His siblings thinned from lack of food. His mother aged years within months. But none of them knew the boy had already chosen his own path beneath the earth. And so the mine waited on. Its silent shaft loomed, patient, knowing he would return soon with flame in hand. The town would remember Hale's words, though not yet. Not until it was far too late. The night Caleb chose was colder than most, the kind of cold that stung the lungs and cracked the earth's surface into brittle glass. Clouds smothered the moon, plunging the valley into heavy shadow. The boy rose from his bed in silence, careful not to stir his siblings. His mother slept hunched in a chair by the fire, an old blanket wrapped around her shoulders. His father wheezed faintly on the cot, the coughs quieter these days only because the man's strength was nearly gone. Caleb pulled the lantern from under the loose floorboard. The flame sparked alive with a trembling glow, small but steady. He stared at it for a long moment before tucking it close, clutching it like a secret alive in his hands. Then, with boots muffled against the dirt, he stepped out into the bitter dark. The town was silent. No wagons creaked, no voices carried. Only the low sigh of wind pressing against the wooden shacks. Smoke drifted from chimneys like skeletal fingers reaching upward, and the whole valley seemed to breathe in shallow rhythm. Caleb trembled, but his feet carried him onward. The ridge waited. When he reached the colliery yard, it lay deserted. The horses huddled in their sheds, the cart stilled. Snow lingered in patches, glowing faint in the lantern light. And there, framing the side of the mountain, yawned the shaft. Its edges caught the pale flame, but the dark inside swallowed the light whole. For a long moment, he stood at its threshold. Every visit before had ended here, or with only tentative steps into the shallow dark. But not tonight. Tonight he had flame, and courage sharpened by weeks of inevitability. Tonight he would go farther. Caleb lifted the lantern and entered. The first steps echoed faintly, then vanished into silence as the earth consumed the sound. The air thickened immediately, damp with the scent of stone and rot. He trailed his fingers along the rough wall, letting the touch guide him through the curve that cut off all sight of the outside world. The flame flickered wildly, beating back only a small shell of darkness. Beyond it stretched endless black, waiting like a sea he could not see the surface of. The deeper he went, the more the tunnel seemed less like something built than something grown, like roots burrowed into the ground, sprawling and twisting. The timbers creaked as he passed, many split and splintered, their surfaces slick with moisture. Droplets fell occasionally onto the mud floor, each splash startling him in the silence. His heartbeat filled his ears, steady, frantic. But beneath it, yes, beneath, something else moved. The rhythm again. Faint, steady, like a drum struck deep within the earth. It came not from ahead, nor from behind, but through the walls themselves, through the ground beneath his feet, through the very air he breathed. He froze, choking back the urge to flee. His lantern shook in nervous hands. The sound deepened for a moment, growing clearer, then faded again, leaving him rattled and alone. But he pressed forward, swallowing his fear. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had no measure in the shaft. The flame seemed smaller now, the air heavier. And then, up ahead, the tunnel widened slightly, cutting into a chamber shaped like a natural cavity. Timbers jutted unevenly across its edges, but the center was untouched, raw stone slick with damp. Caleb stepped inside, the echoes of his boots louder in the hollow. His breath quickened, eyes wide as the flame revealed more of the chamber. Along the floor, half buried in mud, lay scraps of cloth, rusted tools, the splintered handle of a pickaxe. Signs of men who had once stood here. Men who had worked, or perhaps searched, and who had left pieces of themselves behind. Caleb crouched, holding the lantern close. His fingers brushed the torn edge of fabric, stiff with age and dirt. And with that touch, the rhythm surged again, louder, closer, as though the cavern itself inhaled sharply around him. The hair on the back of his neck bristled. The boy's lantern flame flickered violently, shadows twisting across the stone as if alive. He spun, certain someone stood behind him. But the chamber was empty, and yet, breathing. Slow, heavy, definite. It did not come from one place, but from every place, filling the cavern with unseen presence. Caleb clutched the lantern tight, eyes darting across the blank stone. His own chest heaved faster, but the sound remained separate, deep, deliberate, unbroken. In his terror, an even darker thought passed through his mind. It was welcoming him. The flame snapped as the lantern glass rattled. Dust rained from above with a groan of shifting stone, and for a moment Caleb thought the chamber would collapse. He stumbled back toward the tunnel, gasping. There, the breathing dimmed again, fading into silence, so complete it rang in his ears. The flame steadied. His heart hammered. His legs shook. And yet, his eyes burned with the need for more. He wanted to go deeper. He stepped back into the shaft, retracing the curve, his legs moving reluctantly toward daylight. When at last a faint sliver of silver blue seeped into view, he stopped and turned, holding the lantern high to face the dark behind him. The silence returned his gaze. In it lay promise, threat, temptation. He whispered to himself, next time farther. And with that vow, he stepped back into the cold night air. The valley stretched below, sleeping under clouds, unaware that one boy had crossed the line between life above and mysteries below. Caleb Blackwood had entered the hollow, and the hollow had answered. In the days after his descent into the hollow, Caleb carried himself like a boy marked. He walked the dirt lanes of Hallow Creek with the same thin frame, the same hollow eyes, but something in his step had changed. He was quieter, more withdrawn than before even for him. His siblings whispered that he seemed far away, even when he sat beside them. His mother noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way his hand sometimes trembled, even when he gripped nothing at all. But no one knew where he had been. No one knew he had heard the earth breathe. At night he lay on his cot, wide awake, replaying each sound and shadow from the shaft. The slow inhale and exhale, the way the chamber seemed to expand and contract with it, the way he had felt not intruding but called. It was not madness, it was truth. And now the truth beat like a second heart inside him. He tried to do his chores as before. He chopped wood until blisters bled on his palms. He hauled water, colder now with melt from the mountains. He sat with his siblings and tried to force a smile. But every task felt hollow compared to the weight of the silence underground. He could not shake it. He could not live without returning. And so return he did. Each time he slipped away, he carried the lantern hidden beneath his coat. Each time he timed his steps so that no one would see him crossing the yard. And each time he walked further inside. The first return, he went to the chamber again, crouching over the remnants of men long gone. The rhythm greeted him, faint but persistent, until he left stumbling in awe. The second, he carried himself deeper past the chamber, where timbers collapsed in a pile of rot, forcing him to crawl on his hands. His lantern scraped stone close enough to smudge its glass. On the far side, the air grew heavier, thick as though water clung to every breath. Yet still he pressed forward, drawn like a moth. By the third, there were no measures left. Time lost meaning. Hours folded into themselves while he wandered deeper, trailing fingers across stone walls that seemed smoother than man's tools could carve. He whispered softly as he walked, though he didn't know why, or what? Words formed like prayers or confessions, fragments only the rock could hear. Above ground, the town whispered louder now. 3 more miners had gone missing in the span of 2 weeks. Their families wept in silence, careful not to let grief turn into rumor where the iron men could hear. But behind closed doors, voices whispered the same terror, that the side shaft was cursed, that it was swallowing men whole. Children crossed themselves when they passed near the ridge. Wives clutched their husbands longer each morning, uncertain if they'd return. And Caleb walked among them, carrying his secret flame. At home, his father deteriorated further. His coughs had reduced him to skin clinging to bone, his voice almost silent. His mother tried to pray louder, her faith cracking with fear as she begged God to spare Thomas. But in Caleb's chest the prayers found no root anymore. He thought only of the hollow. One night, as his mother wept softly at the fireside, Caleb whispered, "It's not God you should ask answers from. It's the mine." Her head snapped toward him, eyes red and wide. "What did you say?" she asked sharply. Caleb lowered his gaze, saying nothing more. He hadn't meant to speak it aloud. But the words still hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. His mother turned away, trembling. From then on, silence grew thicker in their home. His siblings avoided his eyes. Even his mother's touch seemed tentative when she reached for him. They felt him slipping, not fully theirs anymore, as though something else had laid claim. And they were not wrong. The lantern became his closest companion. Night after night, he drew it out, staring into the flame not for light, but for answers. Sometimes he swore the flame tilted wrong, bending toward where the shaft lay across the ridge, as if the fire itself recognized where it was meant to burn. The pull grew unbearable. On a damp March morning, rain drummed against the shack roof as Caleb set out once more. His mother called after him faintly, too exhausted to stop him, and his siblings watched him vanish through the door. He crossed the mud roads, water soaking into his boots, and climbed the ridge without hesitation. The shaft awaited, silent, still patient. He raised the lantern, stepped inside, and felt the tunnel close over him like a mouth swallowing him whole. The deeper he went, the more the sound returned, soft at first, then steady. The rhythm, the breathing. But this time it was different. It spoke. Not words, not sound as humans know it, but his bones shuddered in recognition. His skin tingled with certainty. The message was clear though no syllable was uttered. Further, he stumbled forward, eyes wide. His flame shook against damp stone. Each breath pressed heavier against his chest, as though the air grew thicker the further he obeyed. Yet he kept moving. He could not resist even if he wished. At the chamber, he halted. This time he did not crouch, did not study scraps of cloth. Instead, he placed the lantern at the center of the cavern floor and knelt before it. His lips moved, whispering thoughts he had no memory of forming. Words spilled, strange and broken, half prayers to the dark. The rhythm responded, louder. Dust drifted again from the ceiling as timbers above creaked, the walls closing tighter. Caleb raised his face, chest heaving, and for an instant swore he was not alone. Shapes stirred just beyond the lantern's glow. Not solid, not clear, shadows that bent the air itself. He blinked, trembling, staring until the flame steadied again and nothing stood there. Sweat ran down his arms as the realization sank in. He was being seen. The mind saw him, and it wanted him further still. When Caleb staggered back into the pale daylight of morning, the world above seemed drained, colorless, unreal. The trees had no life, the air no taste. His mother's voice, calling faintly as he entered the shack, sounded like nothing more than wind. His siblings clung to him, but he hardly felt their touch. Caleb Blackwood's heart no longer belonged to Hollow Creek. It belonged beneath. And no one, not his family, not his town, not even himself, could stop what waited next. The spring rains of Tennessee fell endlessly that April, turning the dirt roads of Hollow Creek into deep, sucking mud. Wagons stalled. Children slipped on their way to gather supplies. The sound of rain on tin roofs became the constant heartbeat of the valley. Yet beneath it all, in one boy's chest, beat a different rhythm, the deeper throb of the mine itself. echoing like a second life within him. Caleb Blackwood no longer felt part of his family. He still rose each morning, still helped with firewood, still went walking for buckets of water. But his movements were mechanical, detached, as though only his body remained above the earth while his spirit had already crossed into another realm. At night he spoke less, stared more, the light in his eyes narrowing to something distant. His siblings avoided him. His mother worried, silently. His father, too weak to speak much beyond painful coughs, could only gaze at him with sorrow, as though recognizing his boy was already lost. Whispers in the town grew heavier. Hale, the miner everyone once respected, no longer worked at all. People avoided him now, frightened of his wide, trembling eyes. Some nights, they said, he wandered the streets with his lantern, muttering, vanishing into the dark, only to reappear at dawn broken and shivering. His home stank of rot and damp stone. What exactly he had seen down there no one ever knew, but the man was hollowed. He lived still, but not truly, and so eyes turned toward the shaft with greater fear. No one spoke openly, but all knew. The iron men barked as usual, enforcing quotas, threatening wages, punishing complaints, but even they avoided the side drift. Occasionally, a braver miner muttered that the earth was trying to warn them, that the shaft's silence was different, unnatural. But those voices were crushed quickly, drowned in the grind of survival. For Caleb, though, every whisper pointed him closer to where he belonged. One night, unable to wait longer, he lifted the lantern from its hiding place and stole from the shack once more. The rain had eased into mist, curling across the valley in pale ribbons. The path was slick, mud clinging to his boots, but he moved forward as though carried. His breath fogged in the damp air, matching the steam that hung low across the ground. It all felt like the world itself was dissolving into vapor. The colliery yard was silent when he arrived. The main drift lay dormant, wagons piled high but unused, as though the night itself demanded pause. To the left, the side shaft loomed, the tunnel that had spoken to him, that had already begun to claim him. Caleb held the lantern high, its flame trembling against the damp air. Then, tightening his grip on the handle, he stepped inside once more. The blackness swallowed him instantly, the outside world erased in only a few paces. His flame beat back a small glow against the walls, but everything beyond was absolute void. Moisture dripped steadily from the ceiling, forming tiny rivers along the sloped ground. The silence thickened until the sound of his own footsteps felt deafening. The rhythm came sooner now. Not faint, not hidden, but steady, ever-present. He felt it more than heard it, pulsing through the stone, through his bones, through the very air in his lungs. It was no longer calling him in whispers. It was demanding he move forward. And he obeyed. His path wound past the chamber, where scraps of men still lingered. He barely glanced this time. He had seen them enough. The chamber was no longer the destination. It was only the threshold to something beyond. So he passed it, tightening his grip on the lantern, ducking low as the shaft narrowed once again. The deeper he went, the stranger the stone became. No longer rough, jagged surfaces, parts of the wall had smoothed, carved perhaps by tools long before, or by water, or by forces more patient. His lantern flame caught faint marks etched into the rock, grooves too even for chance. For a moment he stopped, trailing his fingertips across one impression that ran perfectly straight down several feet of stone. He couldn't recognize it, but it chilled him with the sense that he wasn't the first boy to walk this far. The air thickened again, heavier, as though he walked into lungs that demanded a price for letting him breathe. He gasped softly, but pressed forward. Then, ahead, the shaft dipped lower. The ground sloped sharply, pulling him downward into deeper dark. His light revealed only wet mud and stone, yet his eyes refused to leave it. Without fully knowing, his lips moved in repetition. Words streamed, fractured and meaningless, perhaps fragments of phrases whispered once by Hale. His voice filled the silence, though it was no longer his own. Minutes bled into hours. He forgot the time, forgot distance. He passed wooden supports rotted to dust, past stones that glistened with dampness, past air that tasted more like rot than breath. Still he walked, trembling, half in terror, half in awe. And then, without warning, The breathing became louder. Not just rhythm, not just pulse. This was real, heavy, unmistakable. Each inhale sucked the air deeper into the shaft. Each exhale shook the stone faintly, vibrating beneath his boots. Caleb fell to his knees, clutching the lantern close. Panic surged, his heart hammering, his throat dry. But he could not move backward. His body, every bone, refused to leave. Something waited ahead. Something alive, though not as men are alive. And it wanted him. Caleb rose slowly, stumbling as he set his eyes into the dark ahead. The flame bent strangely, as though drawn by whatever presence filled the shaft. His stomach twisted with dread, but his legs carried him forward anyway. And as he descended deeper than ever before, a thought rooted clear and final in his mind. He would not return. The rain finally broke one night in late April, leaving behind skies thick, but still, the kind of air heavy with the promise of something ending. The town of Hallow Creek rested uneasily, its shacks lined with shadows, and its people deadened by routine. Yet while families huddled tight behind walls, one boy walked alone toward the ridge. Caleb Blackwood carried the lantern in his grip, the flame steady and low. He hadn't told his mother where he was going. He hadn't looked at his father's frail chest rising and falling in feverish breaths. He had said nothing to his siblings who still clung to their dreams. He felt no need. Words above ground no longer mattered. His voice belonged below. The shaft waited. This night felt different. The silence along the path carried weight, as though even the valley knew what would take place. No dogs barked in the distance, no owls called from the trees, no wind cut across the ridge. There was only stillness, unbroken, until Caleb stepped onto the colliery road and faced the tunnel. He did not hesitate. His boots crossed the threshold. The darkness swallowed the lantern quickly, pulling him away from daylight forever. The tunnel breathed its cold against his skin, damp and endless. He moved without pause, a boy who had rehearsed this descent 1,000 times in his mind. The chamber appeared, discarded rags and tools still scattered across its floor, remnants of lost men who had once stood here. He recognized them now for what they were, not warnings, but markers along the path. And so he pressed further still. The shaft narrowed, twisted, and sloped deeper. His lungs shook against the weight of the air, thick and pungent with secrets buried for decades. The rhythm returned, strong and present, no longer distant. It beat in unison with his heart, binding him to the earth's breath. Deeper, always deeper. He stumbled once, scraping his palms against stone slick with dampness. The lantern flame wavered, almost extinguished, but steadied as he clutched it to his chest. He whispered to it, words that belonged to no language he had learned. They came spilling out as though taught by the shaft itself. And then he heard it, footsteps. Behind him, his breath hitched. He spun, lantern raised, expecting hail, expecting some miner lost in delirium. But the tunnel behind stretched empty, shadows pressing endlessly into void. Still, the sound remained, footsteps that matched his own, overlapping, following. He pressed forward faster, unable to stop. The shaft bent downward sharply into a cavern wider than he had ever seen. When he stepped inside, the lantern light fell against walls etched smooth, streaked with lines his young mind could not interpret. The ground sank into black pools of water, their surfaces trembling faintly with the same rhythm pressing through the stone. And here the breathing roared. It was not faint, not subtle, not even hidden. It thundered. Each inhale dragged the air through the cavern with such force the lantern's flame bent sideways. Each exhale shook droplets loose from the ceiling, sending them spattering around his boots. Caleb trembled, yet his legs bent. He fell to his knees without knowing why, clutching the lantern in both hands. His body shivered violently, not in cold, but in surrender. He raised his face to the dark. He whispered, voice cracking, "I am here." The breathing surged in response, pressing harder, heavier, until his ears rang. The walls seemed to shake with it, the air churned as though alive, and the flame of his lantern flared brilliant before dimming, as though feeding on something beyond oil. Caleb's lips moved again, words spilling freely now, strange and reverent, taught by rhythm itself. Then the ground buckled. A groan swept through the cavern, splitting timbers from forgotten shoring, sending rocks tumbling down. Caleb clutched the lantern but did not move. His eyes remained fixed beyond the flame, into the void where no light reached. He was not afraid. Not anymore. The breathing engulfed him, a final exhalation that rattled the stone. The flame burst high once, then extinguished utterly, throwing the boy into complete dark. And in that moment, Caleb Blackwood vanished. No scream, no cry, no collapse for others to find. Simply gone. The shaft closed silent around itself, as though nothing had ever stirred inside. Morning came sluggishly. Hollow Creek rose to its daily rhythm, unaware at first. His siblings searched for him when he did not return to breakfast. His mother called his name across the yard, panic rising as hours passed. By afternoon, neighbors muttered and searched along the creek, the ridges, the narrow paths winding through the hills. But no one dared step into the side shaft. Not truly. No one followed the trail that Caleb had walked. They knew. By evening, whispers spread across the town. The Blackwood boy was gone. Some said he had run off, tired of hunger and hardship. Others whispered sharper, their eyes sliding toward the ridge. The brave ones admitted what they all feared. He had gone into the shaft where men disappeared, and like them, he would not return. Days turned into weeks. His family mourned in silence, their shack heavier and emptier than before. His father's eyes dulled. His mother's hands trembled endlessly. The siblings sometimes whispered his name at night, but the silence that came after was more frightening than saying nothing at all. The town adjusted, as towns do. New boys grew older and picked up picks. New men carried lanterns and walked into the dark. But always, as they passed the forbidden shaft, their faces tightened and their eyes flickered. And always, when children dared speak, they whispered the same tale. The Blackwood boy had followed the mine's breath too far, and the mine had taken him. No lantern was found, no trace, only silence. And so the story of Caleb Blackwood folded into the valley, a name spoken with unease, a warning mothers gave their children. Yet deep inside, the shaft still breathed, slow, steady, waiting, because what it claimed, it never returned. And Hollow Creek, for all its silence, would never forget the boy who vanished into the mine forever.
Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.